He spent years upholding justice in the courtroom until he found himself on the other side of the law, accused of stealing his own car by an officer who refused to admit she was wrong. The long day in court was finally over. Judge Wesley Gaines loosened his tie as he settled into the leather seat of his Mercedes S-Class, letting out a slow breath. The case he'd presided over, a brutal corporate fraud trial, had drained him, but it was the kind of work he believed in. Justice, balance, reason, that was his world. The streets of Birmingham, Alabama were nearly deserted, the amber glow of the streetlights stretching shadows across the pavement. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, waiting for the red light to change. Then, out of nowhere, flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. He frowned. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't missed a stop sign. What was this about? His grip on the wheel tightened slightly. As he pulled over to the side of the road, he knew the routine: keep your hands visible, stay calm, comply. A sharp knock on the driver's side window. Wesley turned and met the icy glare of a uniformed officer. A white woman, mid-40s, blonde hair pulled back so tight it almost stretched her face. Her badge read Doyle license and registration. She said, her voice clipped. No greeting, explanation. Wesley nodded and reached into the glove compartment, moving slow enough to erase any room for misinterpretation. He handed over his documents, but instead of reviewing them, Officer Katherine Doyle barely glanced at them. Her gaze was locked on him, scanning his face, his suit, his watch. This your car? She asked. Wesley exhaled through his nose. Yes. Is there a problem, officer? She took a step back, tilting her head. Mind telling me where you got it? His fingers flexed against the steering wheel. He'd heard this before. Too many times. It's mine, he said, voice even. It's registered in my name. She lifted her radio. Dispatch, I've got a possible stolen vehicle here, requesting backup. Wesley stared at her. The words were so casual, so matter-of-fact, as if she hadn't just accused him of grand theft auto without a shred of evidence. Officer Doyle, he said carefully, if you look at the registration, I'll confirm that when backup gets here. She cut him off. Step out of the vehicle. He didn't move. Not yet. He wasn't going to be another news story, another statistic, another man forced to prove he belonged. But before he could say another word, a second set of headlights swung into view, illuminating the scene. Backup had arrived. But what happened next would test Wesley's patience in a way he never expected. The squad car stopped a few feet behind Wesley's Mercedes, its lights casting a cold glow on the pavement. Officer Doyle stood tall, shoulders squared, watching as a second officer stepped out. Officer Patrick Harris, mid-30s, buzz, cut an eager look in his eyes, like he was ready for action. Doyle turned to him, her voice brisk. Possible stolen vehicle situation. Harris glanced at Wesley, not at the car, not at the registration Doyle still held in her hand, but at him, a black man in an expensive suit behind the wheel of a car that looked too good for him. That was all they needed. Wesley knew where this was headed. It was never about the car. Sir, step out, Doyle repeated. This time her hand hovered near her holster. Wesley took a slow breath. Officer, I've complied. You have my ID, my registration. If you check your system, you'll see the car is legally mine. Doyle's lips pressed into a thin line. Shet wasn't interested in checking anything. She had already decided who he was. Step out of the vehicle. Wesley had spent decades in courtrooms, dissecting bad police stops, exposing racial bias, and delivering rulings that held officers accountable. Now he was living it firsthand, but he wasn't a fool reaching for the door handle. He moved deliberately slow, keeping his other hand clearly visible on the wheel. The second he stepped out, Doyle grabbed his wrist. Turn around. A dry laugh almost escaped him. Turn around. He wasn't under arrest. No crime had been committed. He squared his shoulders. Officer, I am Judge Wesley Gaines. I am not resisting. I am asking, on what grounds are you detaining me? Doyle's jaw clenched. She hadn't expected pushback. Because I said so, she snapped. Wesley locked eyes with her. He had spent his entire life mastering control in the courtroom. Emotions had no place. He dealt in facts and reason and logic. But at this moment, logic wouldn't save him. Harris took a step closer, fingers twitching near his belt. Judge or not, you don't get special treatment, he muttered. Wesley's breath slowed. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He was asking for basic human decency. Doyle's radio crackled. Doyle, status update. She hesitated because what could she say? She had nothing. No probable, because no stolen vehicle, just her own assumptions. But instead of admitting her mistake, she doubled down. She turned back to Wesley. Put your hands behind your back. Wesley's pulse thundered in his ears. This was spiraling, and Ramirez had arrived. But would he make things better or worse? Sergeant Luis Ramirez stepped out of his cruiser, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose, mid-50s, stocky build, salt and pepper hair. A man who had seen it all. Unlike Doyle and Harris, he didn't rush. He took in the scene, his sharp eyes flicking between Wesley's calm but tense expression, Doyle's rigid stance, and Harris's itching fingers near his belt. What's going on here? Ramirez's voice was even but heavy, the kind of tone that commanded answers. Doyle straightened, keeping her hand near her holster. Possible stolen vehicle. She said quickly, "The driver refuses to comply." Ramirez didn't move right away. His brow furrowed. "Driver," he repeated, then, almost as an afterthought, he finally looked at the ID Doyle was still holding. And that's when his entire posture shifted. He blinked, then his jaw tightened. He looked at Wesley, then back at Doyle. "This man is Judge Wesley Gaines." His voice wasn't loud, but the weight behind it made Doyle flinch. A flicker of uncertainty passed over Harris's face. But Doyle didn't budge. Her grip on control was slipping, and she refused to let go. "That doesn't change the fact that—" Ramirez cut her off with a look, a slow, deliberate shake of the head. "No." Then turning fully to Wesley, his tone softened. "Judge Gaines, are you all right?" Wesley exhaled slowly, but his patience was razor-thin. "Sergeant, I complied with every order. I handed over my license and registration. Your officer refused to check it and instead called for backup, escalating a situation that never should have happened." Ramirez's nostrils flared. He turned back to Doyle, his voice clipped. "Did you run his plates?" Doyle hesitated, and that was all the confirmation he needed. Ramirez snatched the registration from her hand and pulled out his radio dispatch. "This is Ramirez. Run a plate check on a black Mercedes license number." He rattled it off. The response was immediate. "No reports of the theft vehicle registered to a Wesley Gaines." A long, painful silence. Ramirez turned fully to Doyle. "You had this information in your hands and still escalated. Do you even hear yourself?" His voice was low, but it sliced through the night like a blade. Doyle's lips pressed into a thin line. "I was just being cautious," she muttered. "No, you weren't," Ramirez shot back. "You were being reckless." But Doyle wasn't ready to fold. She had come too far to admit she was wrong. "That doesn't mean the judge wasn't acting suspicious," she muttered. "Wesley, spare suspicious." Wesley let out a slow breath, his fingers curling into his palms. Ramirez turned back to him, his face heavy with something close to regret. "I apologize for this, Judge Gaines," he said, voice low. "This never should have happened." But the damage had already been done, and Doyle, she still refused to admit her mistake, which meant the question remained, would she actually face consequences, or would the system once again protect its own? Wesley stood there, jaw tight, his heart steady but heavy. He had spent years upholding the law, believing in the integrity of the system, yet here he was on the other side of it. Humiliated, judged, accused. Sergeant Ramirez had made his stance clear. Doyle was wrong, but she wasn't letting go. "I was just doing my job," Doyle insisted, arms crossed. Her voice had lost its sharpness, but her pride wouldn't let her back down completely. "How was I supposed to know who he was?" Ramirez stared at her. "You weren't supposed to know who he was. You were supposed to do your job right." But Doyle still didn't look at Wesley. She never had. Wesley inhaled through his nose, gathering every ounce of patience he had left. "Officer Doyle, I'd like to hear it from you," he said, his voice measured. "Do you believe you had legitimate cause to pull me over?" Ramirez didn't argue. He reached for his radio dispatch. "Patch me through to Captain Emerson. We have an urgent situation." A beat of silence. "Then copy that. Connecting you now." Dial's chest, her composure finally cracking. "You're really doing this?" she snapped at Wesley. His face stayed calm, steady. "Yes, because if he didn't, who would? And this time, for once, the system had to answer for itself." But the real test wasn't just what happened tonight, it was what came next. The ride home felt different. The roads were the same. The city lights still flickered against the windshield. But Wesley wasn't the same man who had left the courthouse hours earlier. He had always believed in justice, in the law, in the idea that if you played by the rules, the system would work. But tonight proved otherwise. He pulled into his driveway and sat there for a long moment, the weight of everything settling on his shoulders. Would Doyle face real consequences, or would she be shuffled to another precinct, given sensitivity training, and allowed to continue her unchecked power trips? He had seen it before too many times. But this time, it was his name on the complaint, his status, that forced accountability, and that was the part that sat like a stone in his gut. Because what if he hadn't been a judge? What if he had been an average black man on his way home from work, someone without a title to shield him? Would he have been arrested, thrown to the ground? Worse, the thought made his fingers tighten around the steering wheel. This wasn't just about him, this was about every other black man who wouldn't have a Sergeant Ramirez to intervene, who wouldn't have the privilege of walking away with their dignity intact. His mind drifted back to Doyle, her arrogance, her defiance, the way she refused to admit she was wrong. That wasn't just one cop, that was a culture, a system, one that only changed when pressure was applied, and that was exactly what he intended to do tomorrow. He wouldn't just file a complaint, he would push, he would demand transparency, consequences, change, because if even a judge could be treated like this, what did that mean for everyone else? He exhaled, shaking his head. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning, and this time he wasn't just wearing the robe of a judge, he was standing as a man demanding justice. If you believe in accountability, if you believe this story matters, make your voice heard, share this. Speak up. Change happens when we refuse to stay silent.